Well, I want to put a pin in that because I want to come
Yeah.
back to this. But we've mentioned the Satanic Panic twice now,
Mm,
and it occurs to me that you and I are of an age that we know
mm.
exactly what that is, but a younger viewer might not. Can you remind us what the Satanic Panic was?
So in the 80s, predominantly spilling into the 90s, there was this hysteria that gripped the United States, and not only the United States, but it was really prevalent here. Um, Urban legends abounded that there were cults of satanic ritual abuse, that heavy metal music by people like Ozzy Osbourne, Alice Cooper, if you played their music backwards, there were messages that were all about corrupting the youth and converting them basically to Satanism. There were a couple of books. The one that comes to mind because it shares a name with me, Michelle Remembers, an entirely spurious but sold as nonfiction account of a young woman who claimed, her psychologist claimed that through hypnotherapy, she was recalling this really, really gratuitous abuse. And it became pretty much a bestseller. Now, people don't engage their brains with things like this because, of course, in Michelle Remembers, she's talking about having, like, being forced to have babies, and her babies are taken from her and they're being used in the sacrifice. She's poked with hot pokers, she's burned, she's cut. But when she accepts the pure light of Jesus into her heart, she is miraculously healed of all of the scars she has borne from this. So
Sure.
there's no that it ever happened. And that's not the only book that happened, but it definitely fanned the flames. There were um, there were professionals who would go to police, uh, basically who would educate, and they would travel around the country, and they would purport to be experts on this satanic ritual abuse, on the occult, and mostly what they were radical Christians who had honestly a vested interest in converting more people to their type of Christianity and convincing them that anything that was not that or approved by that was satanic. So the peace symbol was satanic,
Right.
hippie lifestyle was satanic, crystals, D&D, any role-playing game, most heavy metal music, the goth movement, pretty much anything that was fringe was satanic and by default must be snuffed out.
Anything that was an other
Yeah,
could be viewed through the lens of Satanism.
yeah.
I remember, I think Judas Priest had to go on trial at some point to explain what their records meant, and they had to have their records played backwards to them in the courtroom.
Yeah, it was. It's if you didn't live through it, it seems, the madness of crowds. Like,
It seems cartoonish.
yeah, but it was a widespread delusion, and people took it incredibly seriously. My great aunt, I had a lovely collection of old D&D, like the original stuff. All of that went into the trash,
Hmm.
and I lost books and things. To be fair, the town I grew up in, it was a small town, and I've never been in closets really much in my life, whether it's the coffin closet or otherwise. And so I had local police just, if I pulled out of my driveway, there was one fellow who would just follow my car, hoping I would go over the speed limit so he could pull me over because they were sure there had to be drugs or something. So I got some harassment personally. Nothing compared to Damien Eccles, a friend of mine who ended up on death row for nearly 20 years.
Yeah, a couple documentaries made about him.
Hmm.
The Paradise Lost series.
Yeah, and he was, a young fellow from a pretty crappy background who was definitely into heavy metal music, dressed all in black, did experiment and practice magic as well as vampirism. He's, you know, not shy about admitting that, and still pursues all of those things. But it definitely put his head on the chopping block.
What do you think, if you compare the Satanic Panic of the 80s to the vampire hysterias that gripped parts of Europe and parts of America for many years, what do you think our modern day version of that is here in the 21st century?
Oof. Some of that's going to have to get kind of political. I mean, the core of it does come down to othering. What lies beyond the bounds? The vampire panics had so much to do with contagion. People were sick, and
Mm-hmm.
oh, There's a really obvious one. So in the vampire hysteria, it was because people were getting sick and people did not understand contagion and corruption and disease. And so whole families would die, and they assumed that the dead relative was coming back and taking their lives, not that they happened to share the same roof and the same breath,
Sure.
and they were, you know, getting each other sick.
To their credit, there's actual consequences. There's life and death things going on, and I can almost forgive them for panicking.
Yeah,
More so than during the Satanic Panic, where's the body? You
yeah.
know,
Well,
where's the harm in someone listening to heavy metal music? I don't see the bodies piling up.
it was a conceptual body. You have to understand the perspective of that type of Christian, where if your child is not exactly strictly the type of Christian that you want them to be, when they die, you will never see them again because they will go to hell. So you have to think of it in their perception, it is a spiritual disease, it is a contagion of the soul that guarantees that they will not have eternal life. Now, it's really hard to wrap your brain around that, at least if you're outside of that, certainly as I am. But to them, the loss was no less keen. So they had to protect people from basically killing themselves by listening to Ozzy Osbourne, by listening to Judas Priest. And that's really weird to wrap your brain around. And yet we also have
I think
evangelical.
I think that's a very generous interpretation you're giving.
I,
Because
it's
that supposes that no one's out there promoting themselves or promoting their miracle cure for Satanism.
well, and they were, and I mean, there is definitely like lost revenue. If you are not in the pews, then you are not tithing that church. It is noteworthy that it was something that kind of developed cheek to jowl with Pentecostal evangelical Christianity.
That's right.
And we see, I mean, that the evangelical strain of Christianity is particularly brutal to anything that is not itself, and at this point doesn't even pretend that it's not about money. Like the prosperity gospel stuff, like that there's some stuff to like really seriously deep dive in that gets wonky, that honestly at this point I worry that we might be heading toward another artificially stoked satanic panic. But on top of heavy metal music and goth alternative lifestyles, uh, gay, bi, lesbian, trans, all the rest of it, you're also going to have anybody who's not white. I mean, at this point, we're lumping pretty much anybody who's other onto a they're bad, they're corrupting. Certainly, if they're Islamic, they're they're right out. Obviously, they're doing horrible things to endanger all of us. Um, we've tossed the Asian Americans and Asians on top of that now with COVID. So there's this horrible small-mindedness that seems to really ignite, especially when there are a lot of socio-political and socioeconomic pressures. Uh, and during difficult cycles of history, things like this explode. So I don't know. Do I have something that I could compare to it right now? I'm more concerned that we're kind of heading face planting right back into it. And again, we've got the same thing that Joseph Laycock is actually a fantastic researcher to look into this. He's got actually I think he's got a book on Satanic Panic and just this whole movement.
He's on my hit list for these interviews. If you're listening, Joseph.
Yeah, no, seriously, like this is something that I would love to hear him. Christopher Robichaux, also, who I went to John Carroll with, and he teaches ethics at Harvard. He's currently at home under lockdown, like the rest of us.
Mm-hmm.
Is another one to really like ask, how does this happen? Why does it happen? And what are the psychological and sociological precursors and impacts? Because you're right, there are people who completely make their career and their money off of becoming pundits about it. There were folks who, claimed expertise, and they would be paid to travel and speak to your local law enforcement everywhere, and those speaker fees are not minimal.
Mm-hmm.
Who did not necessarily have any background in the occult. They didn't have PhDs in anthropology. Usually, they didn't have PhDs at all. They just touted themselves as an expert, and no one questioned it. Everybody just took it at face value and assumed that when they told them that these symbols were satanic symbols and indications that your children were getting into something that was going to lead to murder, and you should go exorcise them, you should lock them up. Like, people just accepted it.
Well, I love talking about Satan, but
But it's
let's bring it back around to vampires just a little bit.